Good afternoon. My name is John Lindahl. I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series held here at the Nebraska History Museum the third Thursday of every month. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all the Historical Society's programs and services, can be found at our website, nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. We have a real treat today. Our speaker is John Carter, who is with the Research and Publications Division of the Nebraska State Historical Society. John will tell the story about the amazing new view of Chimney Rock and how Charles Savage's 1866 photograph has expanded the sweep of our historical vision of the Overland Trail, the landscape, and our collective past. Now please welcome John Carter.
Thank you, John. We don't want to end the show yet. Yesterday, as I was getting ready for this talk, I was absolutely astonished by how much I had forgotten about this topic. It's a long and interesting journey, and quite an improbable one. And it really starts with this little photograph here. A photograph of Chimney Rock taken in 1886 by Charles Roscoe Savage. Astonishing for several reasons. The first, if you think about it, I think a good estimate, I mean, there was no turnstile, nobody stood there and counted, but I think a good number is that during the heyday of the Overland Trail, about 500,000 people passed by Chimney Rock on their way to Oregon, Utah, California, and God knows where else. And those people, a lot of them, wrote about experiencing Chimney Rock when they came upon it. It is one of the promontories that actually breaks the rather relentless horizontality of the Platte River Valley that they'd been traveling on for quite some time. And so notable, a thing that caught people's attention. Now, the heyday of the Overland Trail coincides rather nicely with the birth of photography. Photography was born in France in 1839 and grew in popularity very quickly in the United States, and certainly by 1866 had become ubiquitous. It was a major tool for remembering the carnage of the Civil War. It's how families held themselves together. It was an important part of our social makeup. Okay, think about it today. People do keep count now, and we have about 25,000 people a year who visit Chimney Rock. And let's assume that those 25 people take 4 pictures each, which I consider to be a very conservative estimate, especially in the days of digital imaging where you don't think every time you trip the shutter, I just spent $1. It's very easy to go out and just make a whole bunch of pictures and download them on your computer. So presume 4, that means 100,000 photographs are taken of Chimney Rock every year. Nice comparison. And if we're talking about 25,000 people a year, that's about the same number as passed by Chimney Rock during the halcyon days of overland travel. So we've got an interesting comparable. Now, imagine the 100,000 images a year compared to the, that would be almost none that were taken in the years that people traveled on the Oregon Trail. And in fact, we know of only 3 possible photographers who might have been out there and made photographs of it. The earliest was John Wesley Jones, probably not him. Mr. Jones was traveling from Sacramento to St. Joseph. He was coming from west to east with a bevy of artists, sketch artists, and photographers, taking pictures for what would become his monumental work, what he called the Pantascope. The Pantascope was a painting 9 feet high and about half a mile long. It was on rollers, and for a number of years, Jones would stand in front of this thing, and assistants would reel it from one capstan to another, displaying all of the splendors found on that overland route. He based this on the sketches that his artists made and the photographs that they took. We know they were around Chimney Rock long enough to make photos. One of the sketch artists, William Cushenberry, who will be shortly the subject of a book, made several really interesting sketches of it. But at the end of the day, and we know because of what Jones left in writing, that his troupe on their journey made about 1,500 daguerreotypes, 1,500 images. First photograph of the Rocky Mountains, first photograph of bison, on and on and on. They were the first to do a lot of the stuff that have become the icons of what we now consider the American West. But they were notes. They were not serious pieces, and as near as scholars can tell, when he got done with his paintings, he threw them away because they were just these little bitty things, and he was interested in this gigantic moving painting, literally a motion picture, that is also lost to us. So we know he was there, and we know he had a camera with him, and it's kind of hard to imagine that if you're there and if you have a camera with you, this wouldn't be one of the photographs that was taken. But it's nowhere to be found and not likely. We also know, and this is where the story begins. I got ahead of myself. In, I believe, 1993, I did an article on 2 photographs that we had recently acquired of what you see on the cover here, a photograph of a Mormon encampment at Wyoming, Nebraska. Wyoming is just north of Nebraska City on the Missouri River, named like the state for Wyoming, Pennsylvania. So it has nothing to do with what became the state of Wyoming. And we had another one, which we'll see in a minute, of that same band of Mormons crossing the Platte River near Hershey, Nebraska. So these were a big deal. And I did some research as a part of that and discovered that the photographer published an article about his journey, and we'll talk more about that later, in the Philadelphia Photographer in 1867. And he talked about making a photograph of Chimney Rock. And so I looked high and low. I contacted all of the institutions that you would suspect would have that photograph. Nobody did. And so in that article, I concluded that even though we know it exists, like these others that I'll talk about, it too was lost to history. So when this one came up for auction, I immediately recognized it and knew what it was. And so this was one that we absolutely had to have. And at the same auction, and we'll talk about it in a little bit, was another photograph of O'Fallon's Bluff. And so we acquired both of them. And I thought that was neat just in the fact that we had found this now lost photo. But in looking at it with one of my colleagues, Dave Murphy, Dave recollected that this image had been turned into a engraving that he had seen published in a book, the Pacific Traveler, I believe was its title, published in 1872. And sure enough, there it was. But the thing in the, oh, here's Mr. Savage. About the time he was making this picture. He goes on, by the way, to become a very important photographer. He's an English Mormon who, you know, the famous photograph of them driving the Golden Spike at Promontory Point, that was Charles Roscoe Savage. A lot of important Western photographs made by this guy, longtime resident of Salt Lake City. Okay, let me come back to the ones we don't have. The other person that we know likely photographed it was Albert Bierstadt, who in 1859 traveled with the Lander expedition up along the Platte River, and he went as far as into Wyoming with the expedition, and we know that he was at Chimney Rock on the 4th through the 6th of June, 1859. They camped, they talked in their diary about camping at Chimney Rock. And we know that he looked at the rock because one of his most famous paintings, from which this engraving was done, Chimney Rock with an Ogallala village, is pretty darned accurate. Now, I think he conflates a couple of different images in his mind to create this one, but we know he was at Chimney Rock. We know he had a camera with him because we actually have pictures that he made. This is a photograph of a Ogallala Lakota village that was a bit downstream from Chimney Rock, but done on that same expedition. He had done quite a number, I believe 165, though don't quote me on that, stereo views along the trail that, again, he was taking notes. But they were later published by his brother, and very, very few of them exist. I mean, very few prints exist. But we know that he spent time with the Lakota because here he's got a pretty doggone good photograph of a Lakota village about 20 years before Dances with Wolves. It's still a migratory bison-dependent population. You'll notice the guy's wearing a bison hide. The teepees are all bison hide. This is way before reservations. And so he was at Chimney Rock, and he had a camera with him. And they were looking particularly at the landscape flora and fauna as part of this expedition. And so I think it highly unlikely that if he was there and they were there for a number of days, he would have got a camera out and made a picture. But that doesn't exist. This is that view of the Mormon camp at Wyoming, Nebraska. Again, it gives you a size, I believe, and by the way, 1866 was the last year where you had substantial travel on the trail. Very quickly, the train just replaced it. So he was on board the last year you could possibly be there. John Wesley Jones would have been there kind of at the beginning, Bierstadt would have been in the middle, and Savage was there at the end. And so we begin our little journey on the banks of the Missouri River with this encampment that gives you a pretty good idea of how many people were there and what kind of an operation this was. The records we have, and I did find actual accounts of this, of people on this migration, this particular one. They had about 1,500 people traveling with them. Okay, now the fun thing was, I told you about that suggestion that David Murphy made that look in the Pacific Traveler, but I recognized it, and the place I'd recognized it from was here. This is Harper's Weekly, November 2nd, 1867, about a year after the journey. And there was an article about all of the stuff that's going on along the trail. This isn't just about Chimney Rock. As you can see, it's the stringing of the telegraph and the Pony Express and the Western tribes and all of that stuff. But, whoops, excuse me for my ineptitude here. That little engraving up there, the engraving in the upper left-hand corner is clearly the same image as the photograph that we just bought, except they stuck a wagon in it. Now, the thing that caught my attention when I looked at this was the picture on the other side, which was of the Cheese Creek Station. Now, this image, again, this is on the right-hand side, Chimney Rock is on the left, reminded me of a photograph that I hope I have in the right order here. Here, by the way, they identify it as a Pony Express station. Cheese Creek never was. My suspicion is that back when they were doing the engraving, the editors conflated Cheese Creek Road Ranch with Rock Creek Station, which was a Pony Express station, and so the two of them came together, and this became Cheese Creek. But here's a photograph we have in the collection. Look familiar? Okay. The photograph, we only have a copy of the photograph. The original, who knows where it went. But it was one that the Society made in about 1930, and it came from one Anna Keyes Maris, whose grandfather, William Keyes, ran the place, and she claimed took the photograph. I kind of doubt that. I think that's one of the things that happens with memory over time, that the photograph existed, Granddad had the photograph, therefore, oh, and Granddad was a photographer, but in Iowa, not in Nebraska. The reason I don't think it was him was, one, photography was not a simple thing to do, and there are no others that exist from this guy. But more importantly, in Savage's Philadelphia Photographers article, he writes, the road from Nebraska City to Fort Kearney presents but few objects of special interest to photographers. Oh, and by the way, they're taking what we now call the Fort Kearney cutoff. It's one where you start at Nebraska City and diagonal your way up to Fort Kearney. I secured negatives of one or two overland stations with a few rural scenes not remarkable for any particular feature, different from the same genre anywhere else. He talks about having made photographs of these road ranches. These are the equivalent of the rest stops and quick shops along highways today. It's where you would stop and gather yourself together and get supplies and move on. Oops. You can see my confusion from yesterday. The photograph, oops, here we go. This was later run in a Lincoln Journal-Star newspaper story identified as the Homestead of Jw Kramer. And the interesting thing about it is that by the 1930s, when the story with the illustration ran in the Lincoln newspaper, the location had been moved about 130 miles southwest, and the image was attributed to Albert Bierstadt, who they claimed was hunting with Buffalo Bill Cody and several prominent Omaha citizens, where he made sketches of this Harlan County house. Well, clearly here they're conflating the story of the Grand Duke Alexis hunt some years later, and so that story gets conflated with the photograph. So at any rate, next we have this. And it's another road ranch, belonging to Roland Reed, and it's, I believe, just a little bit west of what is now Beaver City. The Cheese Creek Ranch was south of present-day Denton. This is a little further down the trail. And I'm, again, modestly convinced that this photograph was, in fact, made by Charles Savage because Roland Reed's son, William, wrote a letter to, or actually wrote an article, a reminiscence that I believe appeared in Nebraska History in 1937, and this is what William said in 1937. I well remember the Mormon trek, how they stopped and took 2 pictures of the old ranch house and our family. They had a large caravan, some 20 wagons, 4 yoke of oxen on each. These wagons were covered with high boxes and carried very heavy loads. They were 3 times the size of our wagon box today. Some of the colonists were walking, others drove oxen and rode. They went over to Beaver Creek to establish their camp for the night, but purchased food, supplies from my father and trading post. I remember that it was late afternoon when the pictures were taken. Okay, so we have this photograph that was loaned to us by Reed's son back in the 1930s again. The original is since gone. But there is another version of this photograph that appears in a community history brochure that was published in 1932. He talks about there being 2 photographs taken, and we know that those 2 photographs actually exist. We have a copy of one, and another was published. That marches us pretty well along. Wyoming, Nebraska, to Cheese Creek to the Roland Reed Road Ranch, and now on to Fort Kearny. In the Philadelphia Photographer, Savage writes, when we reached Fort Kearny, it was a blowing gale of wind, but in spite of that, I made a desperate effort to take the fort with indifferent success. Now, the emphasis was his, and I think what he's trying to do is play on the idea of taking a fort. But a number of years ago, and I'm guessing this was in the mid-'80s, a gentleman loaned us a photograph of Fort Kearny taken in 1866. And if you'll notice, all of the trees look like little puffs of cotton. They're blurring. With a rather slow shutter speed and a decent, quote, gale of wind, end of quote, the trees would be a blur because they would be moving. And so you put all the pieces together, and I think one can safely assume that this is, in fact, the photograph of Fort Kearny that Charles Savage made on this same trek. Okay, one more dot in the map of our overland trail. Then we get to the crossing near present-day Hershey, Nebraska. This was the lower crossing, I believe they call it. There were 3 of them along there. And I've always loved this photograph because, well, at the time we acquired this one, which would have been in the early 1990s, Nebraska and Colorado were, of course, fighting over downland flow of the Platte River, and the people in Colorado were making the argument that the Platte River traditionally went dry in the summertime. Well, this was taken in July of 1866, and the horses are just coming out of the river, and you will notice that they are chest deep in water. So much for the river going traditionally dry in the summertime. The other thing is that as you look, and by my eye, and I've had plenty of discussions with people, that you're looking downstream, you see that people are crossing the river at a wide variety of places, which really does kind of make sense, that you're not going to get stuck in somebody else's chewed up mud, and so there's at least 2 other batches of wagons that are pulling themselves out on that side of the Platte River. Okay, once they got to this side of the Platte River, they moved on to O'Fallon's Bluff. O'Fallon's Bluff is a place you can visit. I don't remember what the interstate turnoff is, but there is one where there is a marker where you can go get out of your car, stand there, and you can see the wagon ruts. The place was important because here people had to get off the nice flat river bottom and go up over the bluff itself. I'm given to understand that the reason they did that was that if you stayed along the river, you went right along that bluff that people considered to be a perfectly wonderful place to get ambushed by Indians. And so they'd go up and over the bluff to avoid that, making it a notable landmark. To my knowledge, this is the only photograph ever made of O'Fallon's Bluff. Again, another notable promontory on the trail, but not one that somebody took the time to take a picture of. And that gets us to Chimney Rock. Now, sadly, there was one other photograph in this auction that we did not get, and I'm blaming some conniving online software vendor that beat us out of it, but I'm not bitter. And that was this absolutely beautiful photograph of Devil's Gate, which is really the nice place to end that section of the trail. Now, had we gotten it, what we ended up with, in other words, I was tickled pink that we had this picture of Chimney Rock. But with the odd little tinker-toying back together of these other photographs, Chimney Rock, back to O'Fallon's Bluff, back to Fort Kearney, back to the Roland Reed Road Ranch, back to Cheese Creek, and back to Wyoming, Nebraska, we've got photographs of all of those important places along the trail. And for the first time have actually stitched together a visual narrative of that overland journey. Yeah, here's a close-up of that. And as you can see, and let me just flip back and forth, and I'll apologize, we may not get this done for our friends on television. But going back to the photograph and then forward to the engraving, you can see clearly that they are the same image. That the humans and the wagon in this were added later is pretty easy to tell, and I'm not going to do it for you here, but they're way out of scale with the photograph. This is really it would be quite a big wagon if in fact it were there. So at any rate, I think it's pretty safe to say, since it was published not long after, given publishers' times. Oh, and by the way, the Harper's article said that they acquired these photographs from Misters Savage and Ottinger. Ottinger was his partner in Salt Lake City, to illustrate this. So no doubt about those pieces. Again, put together with the engraving, it all works pretty well together to convince me, at any rate, that these are photographs that were taken sequentially. This is probably that same wagon train entering Echo Canyon in Utah. So this really is the end of the story. And once you get into Utah, there are lots of these photographs preserved. Which then, oh, and then I wrote this story up recently in the fall issue of Nebraska History in 2008. And so if you really would like to look at the details of what I did, you can acquire a copy of this. We certainly have it available through our museum store. If you just contact us, we can get you one if you're interested. And that's the article. Okay, so now we get back to what I consider to be one of the most interesting questions involved with this, which is, why are these things so bloody rare? One of the things I know for a fact is that Mr. Savage did not make these photographs to hang on his wall. He knew that he was going to sell a lot of them. In fact, I know this because of the trouble he went to be able to go take these photographs. Before this, he was already in Salt Lake City went to California, took a boat around the Horn to New York, came over to Ohio, purchased a custom wagon outfitted with a darkroom. And the problems of photographing were monumental. Outfitted it in Ohio, brought it all the way to Nebraska, hooked up with this group of Mormons going back to Salt Lake City, and traveled with them. In his article, he talked about some of the problems they had with photography. One, they're doing this in the summertime. And I know because of several diary accounts that I found of other people on the same train, was that temperatures were a balmy 103, 105 degrees for most of their trek. It was hotter than Billy Hell. And one of the problems with photography is in this wagon, if the temperatures are too hot, your chemistry is too hot, and so you can't produce the photographs. More than that, this is back in the days where you had to make your own negatives on the spot, the wet plate process. And that takes, if you're really efficient, about a half an hour from the time you stop, get your equipment out, prepare the plate, make the exposure, and you have to develop it all within the same process. We know that your opportunities for photography are consistent with what the young Mr. Reed noted in his reminiscence, that they took the photographs in the late afternoon. The reason they did that was twofold. One, it was cooler, and two, the train had stopped. One of the things that wasn't going to happen was the train, 1,500 people, weren't going to pull over and say, okay, Roland, or okay, Charles, get out and make your photograph, we'll wait for you. Not going to happen. And other people had mentioned that you stayed with the train for fear of encountering Indians. So the photographs, all of the ones that he made, were either taken first thing in the morning or late in the afternoon after they pulled over to make camp. Okay, that's an awful lot of trouble to go to, again, if all you're doing is making a couple to hang on your wall. So who was he thinking of? Well, I think he was thinking shrewdly. Because if you'll remember, by 1866, there were, 40, 50,000 Mormons in Salt Lake City? Every single one of them had experienced what he experienced on, and photographed on this trek. When he got back there, I think he found a tremendous market for the photographs that he made, because this was part of your own mythology. And think mythology with a capital M, not a lowercase. This isn't fallacy. This is the foundation of your belief structure. And if you think about it, the people migrating to Utah were on a pilgrimage. This was a holy journey. And so their experiences were very, very significant. Their first encounter with Chimney Rock, possibly their only encounter with Chimney Rock, was something very important. Each one of those places along the way was a major landmark in their own personal history. So I'm guessing he sold a lot of them. Why don't they exist? Well, again, we can only infer from other elements of the past, but photographs tend to have their most powerful meanings within the generation for whom they are created. Think about family photographs. If you look in your own family albums, there are a lot of the faces that you see there that are meaningless to you. They are disembodied spirits. They no longer have the value, the personal association that they had to the original owner. And I think what happened is there were a lot of those early people, we would call them the pioneers, who had these photographs. And then they died and passed them on to their children, and then their children died, and so on. And at each one of those generations, the value of those photographs faded. And so, as has happened with a lot of those kinds of photographs, they made their way to the junkyard. They were simply lost. And so now what we have are the vestiges. And I think the proof goes back to where I started. Where did John Wesley Jones' 1500 daguerreotypes go? They lost their value, they're gone. Where did Albert Bierstadt's stereographs go? Lost. They lost their value, they're gone. And so I think what has happened is that we're fortunate that a few of the little vestiges have in fact survived, and that now we've revalued them. We've passed them back to ourselves, put them back together into this visual narrative of the Overland Trail, and given them a new meaning in our own historical record. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions or...
You said you were going to talk about the auction
Mm-hmm.
and how you discovered that it was up for auction.
Oh, it was an online on eBay.
You guys regularly review the eBay catalogs?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the answer to that question is you can't catch fish if you don't have bait in the water.
Back to that photograph of the fording at Hershey, Nebraska, and you gave your opinion. You said you've had some discussions with people that had opposite or differing. What were some of those arguments that they had?
Well, there are, if my memory serves, and please understand that I am not, my area of expertise is not the Overland Trail. My area is photography. And so I'm snacking off of the wisdom of others. There were, I believe, 3 crossings along the Platte River. And I based my assumption on what Savage said in his article, but it was passing. The question, the real question is, what direction are we looking? Are we looking upstream or downstream? And depending on how you squint at that photograph, you could make an argument either way. So my thought is that it's downstream, but, and actually, if a person were really energetic, you could probably figure out the spot that that was taken at. But it'd take more work, and I'm not sure necessarily where that gets you. So, okay, thank you all very much for coming. And we're clear.